Hey everyone, welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy, I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How are you feeling? Are you feeling any lighter now that Trump is defeated? I felt light for roughly 24 hours, and then both Biden put forth, or it was floated out there to see how people reacted, but a list of possible cabinet positions that was just filled with Republicans and conservative Democrats, completely ignoring the fact that he won primarily because black voters and progressives came out to vote for him. So the anxiety spiked there. And then this week, old Trump was back to his shenanigans. So I'm back to living in a place of anxiety, at least until I was about to say January 20th. But then I thought in the back of my head, until I die. That's probably when it'll end. So that's where I am. Otherwise, everything's okay. What a weird kind of existential state that 2020 is in. At least for me. I think a lot of other people are feeling this, where the world feels crumbling. But personally, I'm here. Obviously, quarantine is not great. But, I got Naomi. I got the cats and Mabel here, so, it's not terrible. But it's that the weird tension in between those two feelings that creates a very odd existential state. But hey, you're not here for an introduction. You're here to hear an interview with my guest today. And who is that? Why, it's journalist David Sirota. And if you don't know who David is, why don't I read you his bio right now? In David's long career, he has done a great deal of work both inside politics and outside reporting on politics. In the early aughts, he worked as a political strategist and campaign advisor on a number of progressive campaigns. Soon after transitioning to journalism, which included everything from a nationally syndicated newspaper column to investigative reporting. His work has garnered him a number of awards, including the prestigious Izzy Award for Journalism, and he has written 3 books, 2 of which are New York Times bestsellers. And this last year has been a busy one for David. Not only did he serve as the speechwriter for Bernie Sanders' primary campaign, but in addition, he is the publisher of The Daily Poster, an editor-at-large at Jacobin Magazine, and a columnist at The Guardian. I first encountered David's work, I think, during the Bush years, or sometime right after that. But David's someone who I find his work, his writing, he's unwavering, he has integrity, he is morally uncompromising as a person and as a journalist. And when he started, he founded or co-founded The Daily Poster, which is basically like a new model for journalism. It's a daily newsletter that does original investigative reporting. And I think it's some of the best reporting that's being done at the moment. It's free, but you can subscribe. It's on Substack, I think. You can subscribe for a nominal fee that, I don't know, I think is really worth it. I think, if journalism is going to survive whatever kind of corporate hellscape is really, really descending upon us, I think it's imperative for us to support good journalism in any way we can, though specifically what I mean here is support it monetarily. Anyway, David is kind of a no-nonsense dude, and if you've listened to the show before, you know that I immediately project my insecurities upon people who are not effusive back to me. But I think I was able to hide that from David. And we had a really good conversation about both how his childhood set him on the path to be a journalist and work in politics, especially progressive politics, but also kind of we talked about the state of journalism. I mostly talk to musicians and artists and TV writers and actors and comedians on the show. So I thought it was a rare treat to get to talk to someone who is doing good journalistic work, to ask him a little bit about, I think, more philosophical questions about his job. So this is really good. By the way, if this is your first time listening to Beginnings, thanks for checking out the show. If you want to check out other episodes, they should all be there on Spotify or beginnings.libsyn.com if you want to download the MP3s. I've done this show for over 10 years now. Like I said, I've talked to people from all walks of life, though if you are here because of either David's work or his politics, why don't I suggest some other episodes you might like? I've talked to philosopher Simon Critchley. I've talked to Bhaskar Sunkara, who's the founder of Jacobin. I've talked to plenty of really amazing writers, including Chuck Klosterman, Rick Moody, John Ronson, Harry Matthews, Sam Lipsyte, Damon Lindelof. Plenty of people, like I said before, from all types of creative backgrounds. So check out those episodes. If you like what you hear and you want to subscribe to the show, you can do that at Apple or Spotify or Google, Amazon, all the big tech platforms that are currently wreaking havoc. Hey, but they're not wreaking havoc when it comes to downloading podcasts. And also, I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Andy Beckerman. And stay tuned. I mean, there's so many great episodes coming up, including Ian Mackay from Fugazi and Minor Threat, Bob Nastanovich from Pavement. That was pretty cool. Tobin Sprout of Guided by Voices. Cy Spurrier, comics writer Cy Spurrier. That was really great. And plenty of other really cool people. Stay tuned. But for now, let's talk to David. Do you mind if I ask two somewhat larger questions? I just I had in my head that I thought maybe you might be a good person to talk to about this before we kind of dive in to the meat of the show.
Sure.
Just because, okay, as a journalist, you're a journalist and you've also worked inside the Beltway.
Right.
And I've been trying to... okay, here's the thing. I can only figure out who politicians are from a distance. I met Adam Schiff once at my wife was doing Love It or Leave It, and he was also on that.
Yep.
And so I met him once, and he seemed kind of like a plastic person.
Yep.
And I'm curious if these people, politicians as a class, especially Washington politicians, is it just a class thing that it makes them distant? Is there something else going on? Are they I live in Los Angeles, so there are a lot of Hollywood psychopaths.
Right.
And I think it's a combination of class and something else, but I'm just kind of curious. You have been around a lot of politicians. What is the dynamic of their personality?
Well, I mean, it depends on, which politicians we're talking about. I mean, I think, I think that they can be, they're Bernie's a little different. I mean, he's a little bit more reclusive and stuff. But I think that, I think they're dealing with a lot of people all the time, and so they have sort of in some ways, I think it's like a coping mechanism when they become like a robot. It's just I mean, they're on all the time. So I think it's a little bit they just have an autopilot mode. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So you think it's more of a they are in some way part of a panopticon, and that changes who they are as a person.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I also think, again, I think it's like a coping mechanism. Like if you go into, autopilot mode because you're talking to so many people all the time, right? Like I just think it's like that's how your brain sort of processes it. And they don't
Yeah.
want to take, and most of them don't want to take controversial positions or say anything too too controversial, so they sort of end up speaking in platitudes.
Interesting. And the other thing I was kind of like curious about is, um, as a journalist, do you see? I've been really kind of like trying to figure out the moment we're in and seeing it in some way as like the last gasp of the Enlightenment, in
Yeah.
which like everyone believed that there was such a thing as an objective reality, as opposed to like obviously there's like a reality, like a physical reality and such like that, but like the way in which we understand it is all subjective, and the best we can do is kind of like asymptotically get close to some kind of like understanding of the way things are. And I'm wondering if you see, especially in like in journalism, perhaps in the media class, if you see people starting to move towards a understanding of what journalism is or what truth is or what understanding the world is as being always full of subjectivity, and that we are just trying to get as close to reality as possible, and there's no such thing as like an objective reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like there is an objective reality in the sense of like, water's wet, the sky is blue, but I think that
Right.
now, you know, we're in an age in which there is not a stipulated set of facts. And so that's problematic because we don't actually have um in a lot of ways we don't have discussions and debates where you can't debate a set of facts if the set of facts isn't stipulated. I mean, that's the kind of way that we used to deal with things in a court of law. I mean, that is kind of a legal term, stipulated, right? It's like we stipulate that X, Y, and Z are true, and then we can debate the meaning of X, Y, and Z. But I think we're in an age in which um, there is much less stipulation of what actually is true for us to then debate what it means, and that's really problematic. I mean, it's really hard to actually make public policy and have legitimate political conversations when all sides can't at least admit and acknowledge a set of basic facts by which to then debate what to do about those facts. That's really
Yeah.
a problem.
Yeah. I mean, I've been really trying to think of truth as like on a spectrum of like controversial to uncontroversial,
Yeah,
in which like obviously like water is wet is an uncontroversial truth. If someone disagrees with that, they are most likely mentally ill in some way, right? Or they
right.
don't. There's something there. But like, I used to teach a class on critical thinking, and one of the things that I talked about was the like, when does life begin, right? As much as I despise the anti-choice movement, I can't help but like on a theoretical level be like, well, yeah, I guess life. There's no real scientific. In science we just picked a kind of like, well, life begins when the heart starts beating or when the brain is formed or something like that. I can't deny that life could not begin at conception. It's an arbitrary line in some way.
That's right.
And so like I kind of push that at this other end of this scale, right? Of a controversial truth. And it seems like there was a concert, and again, this is just from my kind of dilettantish point of view, and I'm wondering if you have a more kind of studied understanding of it, but like it seemed to me in the post Goldwater era, there was like a concerted effort to use as much money as possible to push more and more truth onto the controversial end, through like like building building structures outside of academia that were not peer reviewed, but that could push propaganda.
Yeah,
I
I
don't.
think that's right. I mean, I think that the entire you know, political propaganda world is about um, trying to create an alternative set of facts, and I think they've been very successful at that. And we're at the end stage of that with when it comes to climate change, for instance, where people don't want to admit even that climate science is a stipulated fact. We just saw that at the Supreme Court hearings. You know, I mean, Amy Barrett literally did not want to simply stipulate the facts of climate science. So, you know, to me, that was the culmination of the effort to um, delegitimize basic scientific facts in a way that serves the Republicans' fossil fuel industry donors.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, climate change is exactly like when I said, you know, what happens if someone denies water is wet
Right.
and you say they're mentally ill? It's the same kind of thing because what happens is it leads to, if I deny that, like, if I'm driving a car and there's a gorge in front of me and I'm like, nah, it's not a gorge, reality teaches me a lesson in the same way that climate change, you know, teaches us a lesson when you
Right.
pretend it doesn't, when as a society you pretend it doesn't exist.
Right.
But how do you like? I mean, obviously, I know how you do journalism in this kind of atmosphere of, I don't know, extreme unreality. But like you yourself, like how do you understand how to go forward in this?
Well, I don't think I do 100%. I mean, I think that, you know, you have to try to report the facts as best as you can, and you know, I think that, you know, what's frustrating in being a journalist these days is knowing that you can put out the best story, put out a completely accurate story, and it will be the facts of the story will not be necessarily stipulated, even if you prove them to be stipulated. I mean, I had a small example, you know, a couple days ago where it was we did a story. It was yesterday. We did a story on we had obtained internal government emails through Freedom of Information Act requests, and you know, a couple of the folks on social media were like, "How do we know these are real documents or real emails?" It's like, I mean, okay, like we literally filed Freedom of Information Act requests. We got them from the government. They are emails between, you know, from government officials, and you know, here they are. But you know, if you want to pretend that those are not necessarily real, you can construct your entire own reality. I mean, I'm all for scrutinizing and making sure that and verifying, but at a certain point, scrutiny and verification becomes you're not actually trying to scrutinize, you're not actually trying to verify, you're trying to use scrutiny and verification as ideas in order to try to ignore or hide a truth that you don't want to see.
Mm-hmm. I mean, were you aware of this? I'm trying to think about like when I first became kind of politically aware, and it was as a teenager, probably listening to like Sonic Youth and Fugazi and bands like that. Were you politically aware when you were younger? Like, at what point did you start to understand these things?
You know, I didn't I wasn't very politically aware until the 1992 presidential campaign, which I guess I was a sophomore or a yeah, I think it was a sophomore in high school. I graduated in 94, so I guess I was a sophomore or a freshman in high school. And you know, it was a big that was a big election because it was, you know, George H.W. Bush was the extension of the Reagan era, and there was this, you know, young uh, Democratic candidate, Bill Clinton, who was you know, very exciting at that point. You know, because at that point politics seemed very, you know, run by old people and
Mm-hmm.
conservative, and Bill Clinton managed to be, you know, he was the first really baby boomer president, and so it was very exciting. And I remember representing the Clinton campaign at our school's debate. You know, I wasn't pretending to be Bill Clinton, but I was the sort of took the there was a big debate, and I was the Clinton campaign person, and then there was a Perot person, and then there was a Bush person. And I got really into it. And from there I later went to college a couple of years later, and ended up actually the Democratic Convention in 1996 while I was in college was in the city where I went to college. I went to Northwestern, so the convention was in Chicago, I guess, so the area, not the city, but and I got to go to the convention, and I worked on a campaign when I was in college, and so I mean that's really how it started.
Were your parents political at all, or were they?
No, I mean they were like standard kind of uh, boomer generation
Yeah,
regular Democrats, but they weren't super into politics.
yeah. My
I
parents
mean
are
they
the
were,
same way.
yeah, I mean they were sort of normies, right?
I mean, we grew up. It kind of. You're a little older than me, but we kind of grew up in the same era, kind of in the same area. I'm from Reading, Pennsylvania,
Oh, okay.
and you grew up outside Philly, right?
Right, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it just like when I was growing up, you just like Republican. I mean, it's not it hasn't changed in any way. I don't really mean when I say Republicans are evil, as I am about to say, but like that was the prevailing kind of sentiment in my household in some way. I mean, Reagan, in retrospect, was evil, you know, in a very like clear moral way. I mean, that's some of the, when you write in the Daily Post or when you write like a kind of editorial note, and I get the sense of you as a very, very kind of ethical person.
Well, I try to be. It's there are a lot of incentives not to be, that's for sure. There are a lot of incentives to cut corners, and I've really, really tried not to. And I don't think I have. And I think that it's frustrating to be in a world in a business and in a world where I think there really is very little accountability in general.
Mm-hmm.
That there are not that many disincentives or deterrents to being unethical I mean in a sense in some ways I'm less worried. I'm less concerned about straight up ethics. I mean I think I am an ethical person, but I actually think there's a deeper moral corruption that pervades politics and media, probably our larger society, which is to say that especially in politics, which is supposed to be an endeavor about helping people, making the world a better place, I think that people who think that we're now in such a cynical culture where people who work
Yeah.
in politics, who hold on to ideas that they're working for a common good, a better country, et cetera, that's almost seen as quaint and cute and kind of um, like pat the person on the head, like they're naive, how innocent you must be. And we've come to accept that politics is just this utterly cynical and frankly corrupt endeavor. Same thing with media, and that notions of making the world a better place through this kind of work is almost a joke. And on top of it being a joke is that people who behave unethically or corruptly uh, almost never face consequences for that. So within that world, you know, working to not sell out, working to not just, you know, uh, do things just to get yourself a personal gain or a personal benefit, doing things that don't deceive or manipulate uh, the public, the audience, the constituents, voters. I mean, the trying to behave that way, there's not a lot of incentives to behave that way in this line of work. The only real incentive, frankly, is for me, is I want to be able to wake up in the morning and look at myself in the mirror and feel good about myself and feel like I have a soul.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I think that's, but there's a lot of incentives not to behave that way.
Yeah.
And I think we're now, and again, I don't think it's just politics and media. I think it's kind of everything. I think that, and I think the lack of accountability in our society is just really a hugely unexplored and problematic dynamic where, and you can trace it, right? I mean, the people who created the Iraq War and all the lies, the people who created the financial crisis, the people who created the crime bill, the people who created Wall Street deregulation, the people who created any number of absolutely terrible policies that were evil, and they knew they were evil and pernicious and deliberately punitive. The people, for the most part, who created those policies have been rewarded. I mean, so in other words, they haven't just not faced consequences. They've actually been rewarded for those things.
Yeah.
Even as we know those things are not even controversial or debatable in the sense of being good or bad, right? Like the people who created the Iraq War based on lies did a definitively bad thing. That is bad. We can all, I think, stipulate that was bad. Same thing for the financial crisis. Yeah, bad, evil, whatever you want to call it. We can all stipulate, at least I think most people can stipulate that was bad. And yet the people who created those policies, who did those things, knowingly did those things, didn't just didn't just accidentally do them, like literally thought about doing them, did them, things went were bad. Those people have not just not faced consequences, they've been rewarded. And that really is at if you really strip away everything on different policies, we can debate climate change, we can debate this and that, but really at the core, when you trace it all the way back to where horrible policies and horrible events like that come from, it comes from the fact that there is no deterrent for doing those horrible things. There's almost never accountability or justice brought to the people who created those things. So, we get a climate crisis that potentially the policies may make those, even today, may make the crisis even worse, deliberately worse. And that crisis was created by oil and gas companies that knew about the fact that their businesses were creating climate change. They knew they were never punished, and they probably won't be punished. So you can trace it on every single issue all the way back to this idea that there's just no deterrent, no accountability. The only deterrent is kind of, will people in these positions of power have an actual soul? Can they get up and look at themselves in the mirror, knowing that what they're doing is destroying the world? And frankly, lots and lots of people in this kind of work can get up in the morning, having done really bad things, knowing that they did really pernicious and evil things, and look at themselves in the morning and feel fine.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of why I asked at the beginning about you've been around these people. I have only mostly seen them from a distance. But, I mean, part of my, asking all these questions is because, I see these larger cultural trends in my head, at least. The dying gasps of the Enlightenment and of our understanding of truth. And at the same time, you also have this kind of exhaustion that set in sometime at the beginning of the neoliberal period, right? In the mid 70s or so, when you were born. And that exhaustion, I think, allowed the corruption to creep in. Again, this is all anecdotal. I'm not a scholar, so take it with a grain of salt. But the reason I ask some of these questions is because I'm this is the atmosphere we were created in, and our personalities and our subjectivity was created in. And I'm curious specifically about you. How did you become an ethical person? Why is this a concern for you? Is it you were raised religious? Do you just have no, because I also have the same thing, and it comes from, I think my parents raised me with a very, with a Jewish morality, right? Which is very, you give charity. There's no reward. You don't go to heaven at the end of the day, right? You just give charity because it's a good thing to do. You do acts of loving kindness because those are good things to do. And then punk music, reinforce that.
I would love to ascribe my own behavior to an inner sense of morality. And I do think that's part of it. And I grew up in a tradition where, tikkun olam and all that about, work to heal the world. And the Pirkei Avot quote is one of the most meaningful quotes to me, which is that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's, you don't have, it's not your responsibility to finish the work, but you have an obligation to continue the work. Like, you can't say, you're not going to save the world yourself, but that doesn't absolve you from the obligation of doing the work. So that, those are very important ideas to me. But I also would say that I for various reasons, I have a respect for rules.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I break rules, and my career, my job, the way I've done my career has, in some ways, I'm not such a great hero, but like my career has been a weird career in the sense that I've been in politics, been in journalism, sort of swum upstream, kind of, people in these worlds are like, are you, wow, people usually go from politics, from journalism into politics. You've gone from politics into journalism. And, like I keep taking the harder path. Right. I mean, I really, every time I've found a fork in the road, I've been like, oh, I'm going to climb that mountain. I'm going to keep trying the harder path. But the point is that, I try to play by the rules. And by that, I mean the rules, like the laws, the basic rules of ethics, because I think those rules they're grounded in things that are necessary to a civil society, right? I mean, you should not try to lie to people. You should not try to manipulate people. You should not overly focus on personal enrichment. And when I say that, I mean beyond, earning a living for your family. You should not focus on personal enrichment to the detriment of all other, values and goals and why you're here on this planet. And I think you should follow. And the other thing is that you should try to follow the rules and laws, because unless you are, frankly, extremely powerful and wealthy, there is an accountability system. I mean, that's the other side of the coin, which is that when I say that there's no accountability, I mean, we have a problem in this country where there's very little accountability for powerful and rich people, but there's very, very much accountability, punitive accountability, over the top. I wouldn't even call it accountability. It's, just pure, enraged punishment for everybody else if you accidentally slip over, make a mistake or violate the rules. I mean, or just screw up, right? So I have a healthy respect for the fact that I'm not a billionaire, not politically connected in the sense that I won't face consequences for violating rules. So my point is only that, like, yeah, I have a morality and I think, and I have a soul, but I also have a healthy, fear of what can be harsh consequences if you break the rules, especially if you break the rules, you're not politically powerful, you're not wealthy, and you break the rules on behalf of doing good, or if you break the rules just because you screwed up. I mean, I'll give you an example. Like, when I started, Bernie Sanders asked me to work for his campaign in 2020, and when I started working for his campaign, there was a series of 2 or 3 stories that came out about me. The first one was entirely dishonest, was a completely made up lie. This horrible reporter at the Atlantic, said, "Oh, he didn't." This is the funny thing. This is why it was so kind of evil, is because he didn't say this exactly, but he definitely wanted to leave, and this is what it's become, is definitely wanted to leave this impression that I had been working as a journalist while I was working for Bernie Sanders, for months prior to publicly taking the job. Just a complete a complete lie, like an utter fabrication on every single possible level. And and it was designed to try to make me, who's tried to live an honest, you know, moral, uh, uh, live by an honest moral code in journalism, try to make me look like just a hack, like I had been secretly publishing. This is the wild theory. I had been secretly publishing, horrible articles about Bernie's opponents, because I was being working for and or being paid by Bernie Sanders to do this. It was just a complete made up lie. And then after that, he published another story about how 21 years ago, I was a junior staffer on a campaign right out of college, and there was this sort of controversy between the candidates about a sort of it wasn't exactly an anonymous website, but a website that seemed to be from the other campaign that kind of promoted a quote from one of the candidates. It was it was a mayoral race that I had worked on, and it was a bad situation. It was like, it wasn't a particularly good situation. And I had apologized for it, for my, involvement in it. And I felt bad about it for literally 20 years. I mean, honestly, I felt horrible about what happened. And I felt, and it really shaped my life in a lot of ways. That experience of having that happen and being an idiot, and, I made a mistake, and I wasn't the only one. I was a junior staffer, and I took the fall. And it really seriously impacted my life. The feeling of shame and the feeling of that I had really done something that was wrong, and I really did do something that was wrong, and I take responsibility for that. It was a really, I was 22 or 23 years old. It was a really stupid situation, and my point in telling that story is that, and then of course in 2020, that, I've just started to work for Bernie. Then that comes out. Oh my God, he worked on this race, and I mean, this horror, dredging it up. And the point is that it was all a lesson in, if you are not politically powerful, if you are not wealthy, if you are working against power, which I think we can all agree that Bernie Sanders' campaign, whether you liked it or not, was an anti-establishment, against power kind of campaign. If you are doing that kind of work, screw ups, accidentally crossing the line, any little thing, even 21 years ago, the tiniest thing will be dredged up for the rest of your life. There is no accountability for people who have power. There is a brutal form of accountability if you are not rich and powerful, and certainly if you're doing work that challenges the wealthy and the powerful. And again, I'm not saying I'm a victim here, right? Like that situation that I laid out 20 plus years ago, that is on me. I have apologized. I've profusely apologized since that time. I have felt terrible about it since that time. So I am not a martyr or a victim. I made that mistake. It was, and by the way, in retrospect, it's not to downplay it, but it's not like I committed a crime or it's like a,
Wait, it's such like you're just like culture jamming in some way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it wasn't good. I'm not absolving it. Like, it wasn't good, but like, I don't want people to hear this and think I was like Roger Stone, right? Like, but by the way, so funny to bring that up is that's what it's become. The people who don't like me will still, if you go on social media, they'll still, the people who really, oh my God, this guy's Roger Stone, this guy's Karl Rove, this guy's like, what are you talking about? Like what? But that's the point. It's designed to punish anybody, and it's not just me. And again, I'm not a victim here, but it's to know anybody listening to this, if you work in politics or media or really any kind of work where you are challenging power, any tiny mistake you make, any crossing the line that you do will absolutely follow you for the rest of your life. Every single time you try to challenge power. And by the way, I mean, an example of this, which was a much bigger deal, just to give you a sense of where this can all go, right? I mean, Granted, all of this is on a much bigger scale. But if you watch, one of my favorite movies is the documentary Client Nine, which is about Elliot Spitzer. Elliot Spitzer, I mean, the takeaway from that movie is, Elliot Spitzer challenged Wall Street at the highest level, prosecuted big Wall Street banks, and he had essentially, he was, he had an affair, he got together with a prostitute and all this. But the takeaway is that if you're challenging the I guess the more direct the confrontation you are in with really, really powerful people, the more anything that you do that is risky or over the line,
Yeah.
that will be used to destroy you, right?
Yeah.
And Donald Trump, and I mean, of course, I'm sure people, well, how did Donald Trump get to be president? And, he did all this, he got the porn star and all this stuff. Well, it's because Donald Trump wasn't really challenging power, right? I mean, it's a different set of, like, Elliot Spitzer was trying to take down global banks, right? Donald Trump was trying to prop up the Wall Street elites, even though he said he wasn't, but we all know he was trying to prop up corporate power. So, of course, the same kind of the worse behavior than Elliot Spitzer engaged in, that was seen as like not a big deal. So it really is, when we talk about accountability, the accountability system is, if you don't have power and you're trying to challenge power, there is a harsh system of accountability for you. If you are propping up power, if you are serving power, then you can basically get away with anything.
Yeah. I mean, have you ever read any Pierre Bourdieu? He's like a French sociologist.
No.
He's got this great term. I don't know if it's his, but like, this is where I read it, called habitus. And basically, like, habitus is the unspoken rules of whatever group you're in. Like when I was in UCB, the unspoken rules were you do improv in a certain way. It's called game. You play game when you do improv. Anyway, so that's, and if you're not doing that, people are just like, what's this guy doing? And there's a certain, again, I don't know how we want to like characterize it, but like, as this corruption starts to creep in a more, like, I'm sure politics was always corrupt, right? But like, well, I mean, this is the thing that I can't think about, which is like, is it always been the way it is right now and we're just more cognizant of that? Or has it actually been getting worse? I'm not exactly sure.
I think what's changed a bit, and I don't want to glorify, the past, but I think what's changed is there used to be pretense, and now there is no pretense.
Yes.
That at least there used to be this idea that if you were a politician and you were behaving corruptly, you would have to try to hide that, right? Because, hey, I can't just admit that I like, a giant, enormous, anonymously funded super PAC is just buying my election for me. I can't just, I have to sort of go through the motions of pretending that kind of thing is not happening, or that this lobbyist didn't give me money to do this bill on the floor of the House or the Senate, right? Now it's like there's no pretense. Like there's just no, and I would argue that not only is there no pretense, that politicians and people in politics just behave, and in many ways proudly behave, in corrupt ways, but even worse is that the audience, the voters, the population has internalized that as acceptable, normal behavior. That to me is actually the most disturbing, which is to say, when I break stories, as an example, when we break stories, and I cover both political parties, and I don't make any bones about that. I mean, I'm voted for Biden. I'm voted against Trump. I've worked in Democratic politics. I've elected Democrats. I am a progressive person. I don't make any. Everybody knows that. I'm fine with that. But I also cover the Democratic Party. When the Democratic Party behaves in a corrupt way, I've covered that, and I will cover it. And I'm not. But my point is that if when I break stories about corruption in the Democratic Party, and I'm talking about like real corruption, like this politician got money from this lobbyist or this industry to then sell out voters on, I don't know, healthcare or drug prices, the reaction that you will get, that I will get from many liberals is, well, that's just the way politics works. It's not a big deal. And then, of course, if you break the same story about Republicans, oh my God, it's outrageous. The same liberals, oh my God, it's outrageous that the Republicans would do this, right? And so what's really sad is that the culture has normalized and accepted immoral, outrageous, and corrupt behavior, if that immoral, outrageous, and corrupt behavior is perceived to be happening on behalf of one's particular preferred politician or party. There is less right now, less of a politics organized around basic principles and morality than there is a politics organized around tribal affinity for particular politicians and political parties. And that is really disturbing, and it is really problematic.
And that's that's that habitus, right? And I think here's another example. When I'm a vegetarian and my dad is not, and somehow, like, my dad doesn't have an actual problem with it, but I think he thinks it's a more ethical choice. He's never said this, but I get the feeling. So, like, when we're around, he kind of ribs me about it, because I think just my existence around him, if we're at a restaurant, somehow makes him aware of his own moral choices. And I think in some way it's the reason why, like, Labor had to destroy Jeremy Corbyn, or why the Democratic establishment had to, like, try to destroy Bernie. It's that reminds that they still have a conscience in some way. Like, I think, again, you can see ethical behavior or this corruption on a scale in some way, where, like, the GOP has just fallen into pure psychopathy. But, like, I think things like people who make ethical choices, or who act from from a point of morality, as opposed to my team versus your team, I think that irks some people who don't operate like that, who have given in some way to the corruption.
Yeah, and they've come up with it, and there's an entire intellectual framework built around not just admitting the truth that you've admitted, which is to say, in politics, for instance, then it becomes, well, if I'm a corporate Democrat, it's, oh, the progressives, I don't disagree with them, but they're just not realistic. They're just being purists. I mean, it's just not politically possible. And so I don't think, and I think that psychology is so deeply ingrained that a lot of people in politics aren't really aware of it. It's that there's been this intellectual framework built around marginalizing people who want a politics that actually works for people. It's politically unrealistic, you're being purist, like all that, right? I mean, it's like, it's to the point where, I don't want to die in a fire tornado from climate change becomes, you're being unrealistic, you're being uncompromising, right? I mean, that's where we are right now. It's insane, right? Like when during the primary and even into the general election, when people are talking about the Green New Deal and, you shouldn't push Joe Biden on the Green New Deal because, you're being too aggressive, you're pushing, you're being too unrealistic. It's like, what's unrealistic about not wanting my family to die in a wildfire, right? I mean, like, when did this become, irrational or unacceptably uncompromising, but that intellectual way of thinking about things is now so deeply ingrained. And I do think the good news is that hopefully we may be finally moving into an era where, unfortunately, the crises have gotten so bad that the demands are getting louder and louder for real change. And I think that ultimately we may be entering an era where the reality of situations, imminent crises, life and death crises, have taken or are ascending in the public's mind when the public thinks about politics to demand real changes, even if those demands make people's preferred political party or politician uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that to me is, if we come through this election and Joe Biden is elected president, and he is a relatively weak Democratic president in the sense of, not, I don't think a ton of people love him in the same way people loved Obama or even Bill Clinton, that we are finally maybe entering an era in which at least a chunk of the Democratic Party, voters, advocacy groups, activists, are willing to make actual demands on the party and the new president and the new administration, rather than doing what the party has done basically for our entire lives,
Right.
which is defer to
Right.
its politicians and its president. I mean,
Right.
there is this whole debate, there's this whole psychology here that somehow we all work for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party doesn't work for us. And now that's been the model for 40 years. I mean, the last time in the historical memory that a base of the Democratic Party made actual serious ruthless demands on the Democratic Party was all the way back during Vietnam, when politicians' speeches, even if they were a Democrat and they were better than the Republicans or the right wingers, they would make speeches, but people were being drafted off to war. So it was like, I don't care about your bullshit speech. I want the war to be over because it's killing people. And that, frankly, in a lot of ways, was the last time on a mass scale that there were Democratic voters, there was a Democratic constituency putting the demands for policy change above party deference. And I think there's a chance we are entering going back to that tradition. Now, look, people argue, 1968 then happened, and then they lost the presidency because of the convention and the protesters. Politics doesn't end up, it's messy. It's not perfect. But I would rather be living in a society in which voters were willing to make real demands, ruthless demands, and hold politicians accountable, even of their own party, if those politicians do not deliver to fix the real crises we face. These are not, brush offable crises. The climate crisis and the healthcare crisis as two examples. I mean, those crises literally are killing people right now. And what I hope is that we are entering an era in which, when a Democratic politician, whether a president or a senator or a congressman, tries to say it's unrealistic to deal with climate change, or it's unrealistic to demand that everybody in the richest country in the world is guaranteed some basic good level of medical care, that when politicians give those speeches saying, you guys are fringe, you're being unrealistic, that they have to face real consequences, that the policy change is top of mind in more voters' minds rather than party affiliation and party loyalty.
Yeah. But what gave you this this ability, or however you want to characterize it? When you were growing up, were you kind of contrarian? What gave you the kind of back, because it's tough. Like when you're in the face of a mass of people who are like, come on, just compromise. And you're like, no, there's some things you don't compromise on. Like when you were growing up, are your parents like this? No,
I mean, I think I was always a person who, I mean, it's funny. I'm a character on the Goldbergs and the ABC show, and because Adam Goldberg's one of my best lifelong friends, and it's about us growing up in suburban Philadelphia. I was portrayed as the class clown, and I was always, I was sort of a little bit of the troublemaker, in the sense of I was always asking questions and always sort of within the confines of the rules, but sort of always being a little bit subversive, I guess. And I think it was because I don't think it was contrarianism. I think it's I was taught from a very young age that you can ask as many questions and there's no bad question, and you should always ask questions. And, I think that's just part of, I don't know if that's a Jewish tradition. I mean, it is, Passover and all the questions, but it comes from like, you get the best answer if you ask as many questions as you can. I mean, yes, my dad, like we have in my family, like my dad, when my dad buys a product or goes into a store, he's got a question about a product. He has like 800 questions for the person there, right? Like that's just like the way, and by the way, that's the way I am, right? It's like, there's no bad question. Like, why not ask 100 questions about this computer keyboard I just bought? I want to get the best keyboard, so I want to know all the different, right? So it's like, I think it comes from that. And I think that, it comes from the idea that like you ultimately you probably need to follow a lot of rules and laws, but there shouldn't be any harm in questioning those rules and laws, where they come from, why they are the way they are, and whether they really are the best things for society. And I just don't. I guess what I'm saying is, I don't just like. And one thing I learned from very early on is that you don't just have to accept what people say. Like, what people say should be up for basic scrutiny. And that, I mean, and I hope that makes me a better journalist. I mean, that's the almost the almost the premise of journalism.
Yeah. But I mean, was there something like, do you remember a time in your youth where you encountered, like I was doing that constantly. If I saw a rule that I thought was arbitrary, it made me angry. And I was like, I'm not going to do that if it's not actually helping anyone. If it's just a rule someone made up and then they're like a middle manager and they're holding on to that rule because they can't think for themselves and they need that rule to exist in some way, right? It's existentially important for them. I like that stuff angered me so much when I was a kid.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I also, for me, it was both what you're describing, but it's also, for me, it was also, I mean, in some ways, I've like, my wife laughs at me about this, but she pokes fun at me. In some ways, I've never being grown out of my innocence, in the sense of, you know, the government exists to help people. It exists to promote the general welfare. That's the constitutional idea. Politicians are supposed to be elected to serve the people. And these are all quaint notions, but I still like, there are notions. When I talk to my 9-year-old son, there are things that he doesn't, well, he's different. He's grew up in a different age, but he knows more than I probably did at 9, because he's growing up in a family where, I do my work and my wife is a state legislator, so he knows more about politics. But the point is, you talk to an average 9-year-old, they might think that like, all these basic things that are taught in civics class. And frankly, I've never been disabused of them, in the sense that I know that that's not really the way the world works. But from very early on, I accepted the idea that that's how it should work. So it's almost like it's not that I believe the mythology, it's more like I internalize the mythology, and I
Mm-hmm.
refuse to accept compromising from those most basic principles. And, like, that's why in my own work, the thing that drives me the most crazy, the thing that really pushes my buttons, is when people just sort of accept, and in some cases glorify, politics and politicians who obviously violate those most basic principles. I mean, I can tell you, like, the 2008, 2009 election, 2008 election, and then into 2009, 2010. I mean, to me, that was an absolutely crushing experience to watch and report on, which is to say, you had Obama get elected with all the hope and change stuff. And like, you couldn't help but get caught up in that. And he very, very quickly, very, very calculatedly, and very, very cynically sold out. I mean, he did. There's no other way to put it. When it comes to how he helped the insurance companies, the ACA was a big bailout to the insurance companies. He didn't do much on Wall Street reform. He basically bailed out the banks. And, that was a very, very calculated and extremely cynical decision. Which, by the way, I thought was politically a bad decision. It ended up creating the Tea Party and ultimately Donald Trump. But it was an immoral set of decisions, and it was heartbreaking. I mean, it really, I found that entire thing to report on to be utterly heartbreaking, because it violated the basic things that I had been taught since I was a kid, the basic views that I had since I was a kid. You get elected on promises. Your job, even if you can't deliver on those promises, your job is to make as hard as strong an effort as possible to deliver on what you promised people. And that did not happen, and it was really depressing. And I can tell you that, like, one thing growing up in my life, in my household as a kid, one thing you were not allowed to do. You could, I mean, my parents, they weren't harsh parents by any means. They're typical, Jewish suburban boomer parents. But one thing that was not allowed in my house, it was just an ironclad rule. You do not lie. Lying was simply unacceptable in my house. I mean, just utterly, like, if you want to get, like, my dad didn't ground us, or parents didn't ground, that was not my, but if you really wanted to get grounded, like, people, I think a lot of people, grounding is like a normal thing. If you really wanted to get, like, grounded, really in trouble in my house, the one thing you could do is lie. It reminds me of the whole, like, it's like my dad is like Marty McFly. Remember, Marty McFly is like, the one thing Marty McFly can't tolerate is being called chicken.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the one thing my dad could never tolerate is, like, there's just no lying. Lying is just not allowed. And that, I think, links up to obviously the work that I do in journalism. But I think at a larger sense, like, when politicians lie, I'm going to do this, I'm going to fight for that, I'm going to do right. It for a kid who grew up in a house where it's like the ultimate sin is to lie, it just is still, to me, it like, it's something deep and in the reptilian part of my brain that I can't stand.
Was that something like, is it just this is out of the Torah, we don't do this thing? Was there something in your parents' life where they're like, where
I don't know. I've never asked my dad about it. I mean, like, the whole, like, never lie thing being like literally like commandment number one in the Sirota household. I don't know where that really came from, but it definitely was like commandment. Like, you could goof off and almost and be insubordinate, and I mean, that wasn't looked on, looked on all that well, typical parents. But, like, lying was like, no, that's like that's like a high crime. You may not lie. Like, and by the way, I do think, it is an important principle in the sense of, like, lying in a family creates distrust. So, not lying, being open about things, even when you screw up, right, is like, that's a way to, like, lying destroys relationships.
Yeah.
Lying, and you can take that out, from the interpersonal to the political, in the sense that, like, lying to the public destroys the relationship between the government and the public. And the public has responded like a victim, which it has been, by trying to simply internalize and accept the lying. And that's a coping strategy, a defense mechanism. But the problem is that we don't have trust in our government anymore, rightly so, because the government's lied to us so many times. And I'm not just talking about, like, lying about, like, the Iraq war and, like, weapons of mass destruction. I'm talking about, like, day-to-day lying. Like, I'm talking about, like, I'm going to go to Washington and really, like, fight for the people. And then, like, 2 months later, you're, like, selling out to some pharma lobbyist, right? It's like that kind of day-to-day lying destroys the relationship between the government and people. Just like that kind of lying destroys the relationship between, members of a family. And so, to me, like, there is a morality there where, if rule number one is lying is bad, do not lie, that I can trace much of my life to that sort of idea.
That's actually, I've taken a lot of your time. That seems like a nice place to end, actually.
Yeah. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about all this stuff.
Yeah. Thanks so much for doing this. I know you're very busy.
Oh, my pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah. All right. Nice to meet you. Take care.
All right. Nice meeting you too. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye.